This interview is part of the Baylor University Oral History Program. Today we're interviewing Reverend M.L. Cooper. This is our third interview, I believe. Today is August the 7th, 1980. It's about 9:30 in the morning, a Thursday morning. We appreciate your being with us again.
Glad to be here.
We were discussing last time the early 50s in Austin, Texas. What was it like to be with the NAACP in Austin in that time?
It was quite an interesting period. A number of things were taking place across our nation, more or less in the South. This was the sort of the first big thrust of the civil rights movement in terms of blacks demonstrating, boycotting. You had your sit-ins and your kneel-ins, and you had maybe in Mississippi and such areas as that, you had a great movement on for restoration to vote. A number of bombings and lynchings and things of this sort were happening. As I may have mentioned earlier, these kind of things were not taking place in Austin per se, but certainly we felt the pains of this because we were part of whatever happened to our brothers and sisters of the places. So this certainly enhanced the stimulant to move out in the civil rights area. I did make mention that I guess our big move was in '54 when the civil rights law, the desegregation law was passed in the legislative bodies in the legislative body in Washington. But we were among the first. I wouldn't want to say the first, but we were among the first to go before a school board in the South to present a petition that the Austin Public School start the program immediately for desegregation. And certainly there was no resistance in the fashion that they did start in '54, a few weeks after our petition of more than 400 names of black parents signing a resolution to this request was presented to the school board. They voted to start with the high school in the 12th grade and move back towards the lower. And this did go in effect that September of '54.
54.
Yes.
There was a rather famous case in law that I think was finally settled about 1950. Sweet versus Painter.
Right. Sweat.
Sweat versus Painter. Right. Was the NAACP chapter in Austin in any way involved in that or supportive of the effort of Sweat to enter the law school at the University of Texas?
This is true. I'm not as factual on the whole workings of that, other than I would just know that the NAACP was a part of the undergirding factor. All of this took place while I was at Howard. I came back the first of '50, and this hurdle had been already cleared. But all of this certainly added to the momentum, the interest and stimulation of things that we had known for years was wrong,
Yeah.
but we felt that now's the time to speak out, is and to launch out by
Right.
way of a program that would stand for right.
Well, we discussed last time we were together much of this period during the about 8 years that you were pastor of the church up in Georgetown and living with your parents in Austin. Are there any other significant developments that you can recall in your life during this period before we move on?
Yes. One in particular, certainly pertaining to my marriage.
Okay.
I had been single up to this time. I'd met a lady before going to the seminary. We sort of were looking forward to tying the knot, but she met me before I announced my call to the ministry, and she could never resign herself to being the wife of a preacher. So we went our separate ways. In 52, I met the girl of my dream, and we married. I met her in October 52, and I was quite an, what it said, a qualified bachelor. And we married in February of 53. And to this union in 54, we had a daughter, Lynette Cooper, Esther Lynette Cooper. And made this state, she graduated from Baylor in 76.
All right. Let's talk just a bit about your wife and her background.
Mm-hmm.
What was her maiden name, and tell us a bit about her family and.
Yes. All right. My wife was named and is named, other than the addition of the Cooper, Minnie Ola Patterson. She's the third child of the Patterson family, Albert Patterson family, in Granger, Texas. She had just completed in 52, she just completed in June or May, school closing, her college work at Mary Allen College, which was a Baptist school supported by and large by the General Baptist Convention, Missionary Baptist General Convention of Texas. That school is no longer in existence, but she completed her work in 52, and her mother and family, her father later, they were all devoted church folk. Her father was not too churchy, but he made them go to church. And her mother and grandmother and all were quite devoted to the church. She was in Austin at that time because living with her mother's sister, her aunt, and sort of hoping to get some work.
Did you meet her at church or in some social activity in Austin? How did you come to know one
Yes.
another?
Actually, when I got back to Austin, as I stated earlier, also, I stayed involved. So really, I became, this is to lead up to the answer, I became one of two of the first black deputies in Austin to write poll tax receipts. And while writing poll tax receipts, a minister came in for me to write his, and he was married to my wife's sister. And of course, in our conversation, he discovered that I was single. And I guess the moving of the Holy Spirit, he told me he wanted me to meet
Yeah.
his sister-in-law.
Right.
I'd met several other young ladies, but had not been moved in the direction to feel that that was it,
Mm-hmm.
by way of. So when we met, a few months, it materialized into marriage.
Very good. All right. You mentioned the birth of your daughter. Um, are there other children?
Yes, I have a son who was born since I've been in Waco.
All right.
10 years later,
All right.
64.
We'll remember to make record of his name and all when we come to that period in your life. Well, anything else during this period?
I may just state that we were coming through the civil rights period, and I think there was one incident that we had that I think would be good to mention. There was a case brought to us, an individual who had been abused by the police. I've often said that I wouldn't wanted to see a hog any bloody unless you were going to kill him. We read in the headlines of the newspaper in Austin that a prisoner had to be subdued by the police after the prisoner had attacked the police. We had a witness who saw the police beat the prisoner while he had handcuffs on, and he was willing to witness to this happening. Certainly this stirred us, police brutality, all of this was part of the civil rights. We then proceeded to fix out an instrument of a request to the police chief to release this policeman who had abused a prisoner. We went and talked with the prisoner because we tried to always proceed with logical procedures in whatever direction we took, or whichever direction we take as it relates to civil rights. We checked with the prisoner, and he was out on bond. We checked with him to see whether he'd been in any trouble. He said he'd never been in any trouble. We tried to get his general format of his picture of his life. So then we felt we had a good case of brutality, a witness who had seen this prisoner brought really out of the hospital. He was carried by there, we understood later, to be tested for alcohol. Then the police took him down a block from the hospital and pulled him out and beat him up after. When we got to the three of us committee from the NAACP, when we got to the police chief to talk with him about it, well, he became incensed. And he didn't deal with the brutality part. He said, you all don't realize you're representing a two-time loser. Of course, this is what he threw in our face. Well, be that as it may, police brutality, whether he was two-time or three-time or whatever time loser he was, he didn't have to be brutalized like this. So then we left there. We kind of kept our little instrument to release it because we saw the position of the police chief. We took our release. I mean, I kept it. I had it in my folder. And we proceeded to see the move that we could make. Here again, with him being a two-time loser, we've tried to keep the respect of the NAACP as in whatever fashion we could. We felt that in that he's been to the pen, the press will say that the NAACP is trying to uphold a man who's been to the penitentiary. So to protect what the press may say, we proceeded to get a lawyer, and we picked up funds kind of on the streets of Austin, and the man that we got, he was a white lawyer. It seems that he was just anxious. He was not a racist or anything. He was anxious to just get before the bar and practice a little. And he knew he had a good case, and we were able to get him at a minimum. He was not after the money.
Was he a young lawyer, relatively young? Or?
Relatively young. And he was anxious for this case to get before the bar there, put another notch on his gun.
Yeah.
And so we didn't have to do a whole lots of drum beating to pick up funds to pay him, but he did charge a fee. And we won that part of it. We had the witness, a taxi driver who had seen this. So the charge against him as attacking the police was dropped. I mean, we won that part. The other part, we let that go. We felt that since he didn't square with us in the first place, and he and another friend were drunk, they were picked up drunk, we had cleared the major part that we wanted. They were certainly giving him more time or whatever if that charge had been allowed to stand.
What was the response in the black community to that whole incident and then the final solving of it?
By and large, he again state that Austin was never a type of racist type of community. You'd had through the years the University of Texas, and the Presbyterians had a kind of seminary there, and then you had the Tillerson and Sam Houston, and then you had certainly the legislative body, which certainly would sort of pull in some of your top minds and from across the state. So Austin was never a boiling pot for what we would call racial conflicts in mass. You had those who thought this way or thought that way, and as long as things proceeded, you didn't have a racial uprising.
All right. All right, anything else that you recall during that period?
I think this is the larger part. I may mention, I think it was significant during, maybe even prior to my going back home, and even after my being there, and I did mention this earlier, but maybe not as extensive, we had a number of national leaders. I remember Clayton Powell, congressman from New York. We had the Dennis, who was run out of Mississippi. We had, I can't call it, Lucy Boyd, I believe was her name. She was the one that tried to go to the University of either Louisiana or Mississippi. I'm a little removed from it, and so much water's gone under the dam and over the dam since then. But anyhow, she was one who tried to go to one of the universities in Alabama, I believe, or Mississippi. We had speakers like that coming through, and I thought this was significant because many times you get to see people who had faced much more than we were facing. And just let us know that even though we hadn't faced such, whatever we were doing, we were helping to ease their pain and to fight the cause that happened to be the cause for all of us.
Well, what was happening in your church in Georgetown during this time? You were going up there twice a week and preaching.
Right.
How were things developing in that part of your life in ministry?
It was moving along in a fashion. I was getting the experience that I needed to preach Sunday after Sunday, morning service and night service. And Georgetown was a small town, so you didn't look for no big increase.
Yes.
Things were pretty well stable. I may just state, though, in connection with that, he again, living in Austin, I tried to keep it. It was just so much I could do in Georgetown. I'd drive up on Sunday morning, be there for Sunday school to give the review, preach the 11 o'clock service, and then stay there. Every now and then I'd even run back to Austin 30 miles and come back for night service. But most time I stayed there. And of course, having a wife, that settled me down a little more but they had a place for me to stay and rest and eat, and night service, and then back on Wednesday nights. And then every now and then some annual, like church anniversary or the choir's anniversary in the afternoon, bringing in some visiting church and pastor. But during this span, I think I mentioned one or two other things. I stayed involved in Austin. In '50, I became president of the NAACP branch in Austin. Then Reverend Harold Branch, who is pastoring in Corpus, was called to Corpus. He was serving as president of the Baptist Ministers Union of Austin. And of course, when he left, they moved me from secretary to president of the Baptist Ministers Union. And then the church I pastored was a member of the St. John District Association, which my uncle was moderator. And this association had 5 sub-districts. These sub-districts would meet every 5th Sunday in their district. And after that 5th Sunday on Mondays, they would come to Austin and make it, which was sort of general headquarters, and make a report of the service and funds raised and where they would be, where the funds would be sent or given, missionary, foreign mission, home mission, what have you. The pastor in Taylor was called to Palestine. He was president of our sub-district, the Round Rock sub-district, of which Georgetown, Round Rock, and a few other smaller communities were a part. And I became president of the Round Rock sub-district. And then, after I got married, I had not been working too much. I had to settle down to a job. And while working on a small job downtown, I was informed that the Baptist bookstore needed someone, and I'd probably be the very one. Being a preacher, this fitted into the scheme of things. So I was holding all of these positions and working at the Baptist bookstore when I came to Waco Second Baptist 22 years ago.
So it was in 1958 that you made the move from
Right.
Austin, Georgetown area
Right.
to Waco. But before we discuss that move specifically, I wanted to ask, after you and your wife were married, did you continue to live in the house with your parents, or did you move into separate abode?
For possibly, I'd say a short spell, I continued to live with them. Then my brother-in-law, the one who introduced me to my wife, he accepted the challenge of our first missionary from our convention, our state convention, to Jamaica. And I moved in his place, and then we started buying a home. So we'd been in the home some 15 months when I was called here. Now I had a rent house, but I felt it was wiser to let it continue to be rented and buy another house that's more comfortable and what have you. In the meantime, as I stated, I kept involved, but always had faith that and hope and aspiration that this was not my home.
Right.
And so when it did come, we had tried to be faithful over the challenges that we had. And I guess maybe all this helped out with my credentials. None of the positions that I named had I sought. They all, I didn't have to scramble a politic for them. I was more or less picked, selected.
Let's talk about the move and some of the. Be interesting to for others to know something of the details of how a Baptist pastor is found, as it were,
Right.
by another church. What details do you remember of that? How did they come to? How did the people in Waco come to know about you,
Yeah.
and how did they approach you?
Right. I may just first of all state it's no set formula
Yes.
as to how one is selected. However, my selection, I would want to think, was unique. Second Baptist was without a pastor. They'd been without a pastor. Well, they were without a pastor a whole year. All right. There was a deacon in Second Baptist who was an insurance agent who went sort of covered a certain amount of territory. Well, he would go from Waco to Marlin to include the name of one of the many stops that he would make. He was talking with the late Reverend Jackson, who was moderator of the Good Hope Western District, which I'm now serving in as moderator. He let him know that we were without a pastor and we're trying to find one that we feel, do the job for us, so forth. And Reverend Jackson was was a friend to my father during their early ministry. They started out somewhat together in the Hearn area, or if not in the Hearn area per se, they started out in the same association. So he had heard about me. I guess news had reached him that I was back in Austin. And he said, he said, I don't know the young man, but I know his father. His father's fine, and maybe good to seek him out. Now, this came actually after they had called Harold Branch, who left Austin and went to Corpus Christi. And he turned it down because he had gotten things moving in Corpus, and he felt that the challenge that he had there was greater than maybe leaving there, leaving the challenge that he had already jumped into. So this is one reason why they went a year. They called him the middle of 57, and he turned it down. And then this left them, and they wanted to get one that they felt that would be with them. So he came, the insurance agent, after my name had been suggested. He came to Austin. Well, he had a brother in Austin, and I'm sure he knew me, tried to be involved, and I grew up in Austin. And he let him know where I lived. He came by the house, and the madam and I were both on the job at work. He left a note. Second Baptist Church is without a pastor, and if you get a chance to make contact. He left his name. And so I think following that, he could have doubled back that night, maybe to talk with us. And I sent a letter to Second Baptist. I think I got it off on a Friday. They got it on a Saturday morning. The committee got together Saturday evening. They came down to the church to look me over to see how I operated Gay Hill. And they gave me an invitation. That was the 5th Sunday in December, 57. they gave me an invitation to come and preach for them the second Sunday in January. Said, we're sure you'd like to be here. I looked pretty good that day because we were entertaining the Round Rock Sub-District, and I was serving as president.
Oh,
so
yes.
Looked like I was covering much more territory
That was usually
was usually covered.
Yes.
So they saw me in operation. They didn't hear me preach,
Yeah.
which was possibly good.
Well, they heard you preach when you came up
Oh,
here.
yes, yes,
So,
right.
They knew what they were getting. Well, what were your feelings? Did you know anything about the Second Baptist Church in Waco?
No.
You had no...
I'd been there only once at a state meeting.
Mhm.
I didn't know the pastor. Very few, didn't any of the members know me. I knew some of them by way of just their names sort of being mentioned in our state. So I was, even though we were 100 miles apart, they were strangers to me. And I may mention, too, I'd been to several other churches to preach, which is our general practice. I think Baptist, it kind of varies a little bit, but sometimes names are given, and as my name was given here. But to some degree, where you're not known, you write in when a church is vacant, and you let them know that you're interested to come before them, and if things work out for the better, so well and good. I preached at a church prior to my coming here in Luling, but I didn't worry the Lord, and he didn't say anything to me. I knew that any progress as far as program and my leadership, I felt this, that I'd reached my summit there. So it was just a matter of time when the doors were open. I'd been there. Of course, they felt this way. They felt that any day some church was going to reach and reach to get me. I went to church in Dallas, one of the kind of front-running churches, but I didn't worry the Lord there. I preached that Sunday, and being a seminary graduate, I sort of fitted a part of their credential, but did nothing in jail. I came here that Sunday morning after they gave me the invitation and preached, and one or two of the members said, as I came through the door, they said, there's our pastor, but we just haven't heard him preach. And I had a very similar feeling that, this is it. And they wanted to call that night, that Sunday night. They said, no, let's follow general procedures. Let's announce today that we come back tomorrow night for the sake of calling the pastor. They met that Monday night. So Monday night by 10 o'clock, I had a telegram that I'd been called.
Well, how did you respond?
Beg pardon?
How did you respond?
Yeah.
Did you wait a while, or had you had time to think about it and pretty well ready to decide?
Well, the church, I sort of somewhat knew, in fashion about the church. I knew it was really one of our front churches in many respects, because you have some with much more membership than they have, but Second Baptist has been one of the. So I didn't have much problem in realizing that this would be a promotion. So I guess with my kind of nature being slow in some respects, I had sort of seen myself as maybe going from Austin to Taylor, and then from Taylor to Waco or Dallas or Houston. So that was a route that I had picked, but I moved from Gay Hill, about 70 members, to almost 700 members.
Well, then you accepted that call and moved to Waco.
Yes.
What What did you see as you came to, let's first talk about the church, the Second Baptist Church. As you looked at it, as you were coming as its pastor, what did you see its strengths, its weaknesses, its needs to be? What did you see your task?
Right. Well, I did look in these several directions and see the in one respect the pastor had been sick for some several years, and quite sick his last year, from the first of 56 to 57 in March when he passed. He suffered with a heart trouble. It sort of moved upon him slowly, but with about a year, he was just had to take his time coming in, and Reverend Otis Rush, the late Otis Rush, sort of was selected by the church to be the interim pastor. And of course, he would just kind of carry on. Or maybe he was elected interim pastor after Reverend Johnson passed. But before Reverend Johnson passed, he worked along with him, and they took care of him as kind of assistant to the pastor, assistant pastor. And so, making mention of that, the church building-wise became somewhat deteriorated. Not in a great fashion, but there were so many years you had to do something in all buildings. And of course, this was obvious walking in, needed some repairs and maybe more painting and refreshing than actually repairs as such. And then, of course, some of the things you can't see, but this was in my recommendations coming that I would observe for the first period of my pastorate there during the first year. And as I saw fit, I would make recommendations. And of course, then I looked at the finance, and I set up a program financing. It was in a fair fashion, but it wasn't the kind that I could live with. So I set up my financial program, not necessarily on stewardship giving and what have you, but more or less the financial structure of taking care of what would come in. The records would be given to me each day, each Sunday, of income and payout. And set up the two committees, the treasurer, which was maybe a committee in itself, and the finance committee, which would turn over the money to the treasurer. Because most churches, this was nothing really new, but I started begin there to sort of set that in motion. And then we already had the Young People's Guild, which just a kind of junior church, if we had another name for it. But we did set up a young adult choir. We had a junior choir going. We set up a young adult choir. And by and large, the church had what we would call a general structure that is pretty common to what we would call church life. We did set up the YWA, Young Women's Association, which is, my wife headed that up. This could have been a little new.
What did your wife think about moving to Waco? Was she excited about those prospects?
Yes, she was. In fact, I often humorously say that she was packing while I was praying.
Yeah.
In fact, she was packing faster than I was praying.
Yeah. Okay. Well, What did you see as you came to the Second Baptist Church regarding its place and relationship, its place among and relationship to the other Baptist churches in Waco? What were those relationships that you found as you came to pastor this church?
I may just maybe answer that question in this fashion. Second Baptist was a challenge to me in that several of their pastors had stood shoulder high in the state and in the state mainly. Reverend A.A. Lucas, the late Reverend A.A. Lucas, who built that church, was at the time when I came here president of our state convention, and he was one of the front runners in the lawsuit to break down desegregation, to break in on registration for blacks to vote. He was at that time pastoring in Houston.
But he had been pastor of the Second
Baptist Church, right. And then the late Reverend Johnson, whom I succeeded, had been president of the NAACP here in Waco. He could have been president when he passed. And then he had run prior years to his death, certainly for the school board. And this was when you had to compete with all the candidates, and he picked up a good number of votes. And he was, when he passed, vice president of the state convention. So I was faced.
You had some shoes to fill.
That's right.
Right.
And he was recognized as, each of us in our own way have what gift or gifts. And he was quite an orator. I knew I didn't have that. But they called me, so I had something. I don't know what. But so I had, as I say, this kind of challenge was facing me as a young preacher right out of Georgetown from a small church to come to a church of this magnitude.
Well, let's talk about the community to which you came. That's the community of Waco. A church located in South Waco. In the shadows, or shall we say neighboring university, a Baptist university, white Baptist university at that time. It was
Right.
not desegregated itself
That's right.
at that time. What did you see when you came to Waco and the environment of your church? What did you encounter, and what did you see as your tasks there?
Coming to Waco, I saw something that was somewhat unique to me, in that you had more neighborhoods integrated in a fashion than I had seen in Austin. I did understand that there were some records in Waco. You had the lynching and the dragging, the burning. But on the other hand, you had in East Waco, when we say East Austin, we were talking, by and large, with more of a black community. You had a small community out in South Austin. You had a small community in West Austin. But when you said East Austin, you were talking about, that's just for shot in the dark, you were talking about 80% of the blacks.
Yeah.
But when I came to Waco, here you had neighborhood and South Waco, in the shadows of Baylor. And then you go across to East Waco, you had the R.L. Smith School and the Turner Street Baptist Church, which is somewhat the heart of East Waco. And then you had New Hope up in North Waco, and some section white beyond that. So to me, this was something that I hadn't, my growing up in East Austin was a little different to here. So this appeared to be unique in some fashions. And then to know that they had, so I didn't see any great challenges in certain fashions.
All right.
Mm-hmm.
This may be getting ahead of the story a little bit, but in those days, the question of the Mexican-American community and its place in relationship to both the black and white community had not come into prominence the way it has in recent years. Well, had it come into any significant prominence for you and for the black community in your early days in Waco? That is, was the Mexican-American community in any significant way a part of the larger scene of race relations in Waco?
No.
That was to come a little later.
A little later.
Right. All right.
In fact, they were more, I guess, just a part of whatever it was. I mean, they had not risen, made any noise or made any shoves to come forward.
All right, you described a few of the things that you you did upon initially coming, some of the organizations in the church. Let's pick that up and move the story along. Well, I guess before we do that, I want to ask about Baylor specifically. In your first coming here, were there any contacts with Baylor University, or its students, its faculty, its administration, or did it essentially go about its work and
This was about it.
and you went about your work?
Right.
At that time, of course, Baylor was did not extend beyond about 5th Street?
Right, about 5th Street, because I had members on, let me see, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Street. I had members living.
And that was before the urban renewal
Right.
project.
I got here in 58, and actually, the early part of 59, the headlines came out with the lines drawn.
Is that right? Well, let's talk about that.
Yeah.
That must have been traumatic for the community.
It was. It was to the community, it was a type, just to be frank. It was a type of Pearl Harbor.
Yeah.
It had, some steps had been made in this direction, but they had not been stated with those facts in the picture. And this came as a surprise not only to the blacks but to the whites living in. I think this is generally known. Prior to my coming in 57, some kind of action program was brought about. I'm getting at what it was called, but they had met even up at New Hope. They never did meet at Second Baptist because Second Baptist, maybe one reason they were without a pastor. The pastor was sick. So they had met up at New Hope with Marvin Griffin, presenting the Urban Renewal Program in a general fashion and all the benefits that would come if it was voted on, voted in to the city's program. And many individuals voted for it because of the beautiful picture that was painted that if you had a shotgun house and it didn't meet requirements, money would be available at low interest rates to bring that shotgun house up to par. I mean, just bring it down to simple words.
Yeah.
Because all of this came from Marvin Griffin, who was kind of getting to be the older pastor. He'd been here several years then. But he came here really in about early 50s. So he'd been here then about 6 or 7 years. And so for this to come out that way, lines drawn and everything, sort of came up on the blind side.
Yeah, the community was not prepared for that.
No, they were not prepared for that.
Right.
And this being one among the older communities, too, in certain terms, I guess you could say there's a those community of that one. But see, we just celebrated our 100th our centennial last year. And many of the members of Second Baptist was organized in this area 100 years ago because many of those who belonged to New Hope could not get up there because of the ditch, swollen ditches and boggy holes that they would have to go. They said, well, we can't get up there. When it rained, let's organize down here. So you had a number of individuals who grew up as a part of the generation of those who organized.
You made an inference a while ago to this larger South Waco community that was part of the Urban Renewal Project, that it was by no means all black community.
That's right. It was integrated.
Down near LaSalle, especially what's called the Edgefield community, a sizable white population
Right.
that had kind of grown up, as I understand it, around that textile mill.
That's correct. Mm-hmm.
Well, how did that community respond to this headline and the map drawn? And I don't know what at that time was described as the future of this area.
Well, Baylor expansion.
All right. Was it clear from that point forward that Baylor would eventually get most of that land?
Right.
That was
right.
clear from the beginning.
Yes, Baylor expansion. The Urban Renewal will clear this out for the Baylor expansion program. That was general.
Okay, tell me honestly, how did your community respond to that?
Well, certainly this was quite frustrating. And of course you have varied reactions. You had those who were without hope. The government wants this. They said Urban Renewal, talking about the federal government. So just biding my time till they come get me. Others said, let's fight it to see what we can, see what comes out of it. You know, this is homes that we've struggled to pay for. And of course, salaries by and large in Waco, as I discovered when I came, that been at a minimum compared with other cities. It was kind of low, Waco, salary-wise, so they had struggled to pay for these homes. Most of them had, most of them had, were homeowners, and many of them were still buying. And many of them were up in age, where, of course, this certainly sets one into great frustration. Where do I go from here? I've been here, where will I be as happy as I have been here? In fact, I've just settled down here to die, so to speak, and now they're coming to uproot me. Of course, this is naturally normal. I think when we look at whether here or there, some of these things, I think they've been more prepared for it. If all of this had been in the woodworks, maybe it wouldn't have been voted for. So,
Yeah.
because what happened here did bring about a defeat in the urban renewal vote in Austin on the first round.
Is that right?
This is correct.
The Waco experience
Waco
was.
experience. Because we saw, well, being maybe the pastor of the larger church, I was automatically programmed to lead out in it.
What did you do?
We sought advice of several of our civil rights lawyers in Dallas. We had Lawyer Tate, I think he's died since then, and even Lawyer Dern. He was one that fought the Sweat case and won. We sought advice from Tate first, I guess because maybe it could get to him quicker and easier. And of course he let us know that this urban renewal law is a law that's legal, and they can move everybody out of Waco, black or white, if they want to.
Mm-hmm.
So you just let us know where we were in the outset. It's a legal law, and if it had been voted on, they can move everybody, regardless of color. Because we knew it wasn't just a racial thing, and yet more blacks were caught in it than whites. And then we felt we needed a lawyer to protect even the value of the property, because what was being offered, we felt various homeowners in the committee that the sort of farm was not what was needed to be uprooted here and to go somewhere else and somewhat start over again with what you had. That a certain equity ought to be involved. And this was pretty well the story at the beginning. So those who did remain, who didn't just run. You got some people that'll, it's like birds, if you throw a rock, they're going to fly. Those who remained did get an increase in their property. And of course, the church, in a fashion, as pastor, I had the membership divided. Some said we ought to leave here. Where you going? And it was a question I'd want to raise. And what are you going with? Well, the urban renewal program, which I felt was unfair, actually sought to buy the parsonage and leave the church, which would have gutted us. They're going to come down the driveway, take the parsonage, and we wouldn't have had but just the parking area in front of the church and a little bit behind and a little bit on the side. With our parsonage and a garage apartment there, at least it gave us a little breathing room. And so we entailed to fight that. We wrote to the headquarters I guess I wrote to President of the United States and everybody else to
Yeah.
the unfairness, and because that was alleviated. The church was never sought
They never
at
tried to buy the
at
church.
that time.
I wonder why not. Was it their
Well, under
practice not to secure churches and businesses, or?
I don't think so, because other churches were bought. Under the program, as I understood it, as we understood it then, everything that was purchased had to be torn down. This is how we understood it.
Yeah.
Everything that was purchased had to be torn down. So it was easier, just looking at it from a layman's standpoint, to buy the parcel and tear it down, and the church would be gutted. And to buy the church and the parsonage, you're looking at buying a whole lots of dirt and bricks.
Yeah.
That's kind of layman interpretation, which seems feasible. They would have had to, give us enough to get away, to satisfy being uprooted as church of its size, magnitude. So they moved on.
Did you find yourself involved in a lot of negotiations, I guess, during that time with city officials? Or did you work primarily with federal officials?
We didn't have to work a whole lot. They offered to buy the parcel, and we turned it down. So it was not a lots of scrambling, and we wrote concerning what it would do to us. And of course, for me and others who looked at it practical way, all or none at all. We'll sell all, but all or none at all.
I gather from what you said that the decision was made on the advice of this lawyer that everything was legal. That is,
That's right.
And so it was very difficult to mount any resistance to it.
Right.
Was there ever any discussion of the possibility of claiming that the vote was taken under conditions in which people did not understand what they were really voting for? That is, that the issue had been misrepresented or had not been clearly explained, so as to try to invalidate the election. Was that ever considered as a possible defense?
It was discussed, but how much really weight you could get out of it, how much mileage you could get, may have been questioned, because in that area it was felt, with this lawyer's advice, that you can possibly go to court and win this round, but they can come back the next round and still do what they plan to do. So I don't know. That's so it was discussed, and it was felt that
In the long run, it would not be.
long run not be feasible.
All right. Well, how did your people, your church people, view their future as a church in the face of this rather devastating blow to the community that the church was a part of? What did they see their future to be?
It was, I guess it was varied, certainly. Some felt that we ought to move. But And some felt, we've been here, it's no problem, and my statement to them was, let's have church here until something comes to. Now, as pastor, here again, I said when I came here to Waco, the salaries had been at a minimum in general over Waco as compared with other cities. And to think about moving a church to replace ourselves, we were looking at several $100,000 over. And that could have been a headache that I didn't want to face unless we had the kind of money, at least to uproot ourselves and move, even though we'd have to go in some debt. But with nothing being offered, I wasn't going to try to start buying and planning somewhere else, and maybe another pastor would have done it another way, But to go off and leave it, you devalue your property, and what do you have to leave with? So there's all these questions that, and of course, I've often said I was not and am not married to it, but it takes money to replace what we had, and this was, so my position to them, you worry about a whole lot of other things, let's have church here.
Yeah.
We've got the church, and where we've been, and you've been longer than I have, and worry about that hill when we, because those who saying move, they weren't paying much for us to stay where we were,
Okay. Well, what about the role of Baylor University in all of this? And the feelings of the people of South Waco, and especially the black community, toward Baylor. I don't imagine this helped public relations very much, or attitudes toward Baylor. But what was it? What were the feelings? And were there any contacts made during this time with the Baylor community, especially the administration?
I don't think feelings, were all that high. I think the individual, the layman who gives thought, would know that progress comes, expansion comes. Highways are built, institutions broaden their boundaries, and sometimes we're caught in the middle of these things. I think that maybe the greater feeling was that the urban renewal coming in, swooping in and uprooting. I think it's feeling wise towards Baylor. I don't think the community has any thoughts that would, be worth pointing up. They would vary from one to the other.
All right then, so the plans were announced, and I guess they began to implement the program and began to move people out. By how soon did they begin to do that? And what was the impact of that on the Second Baptist Church? You had members who had to leave the part of town where their church was located. Did that precipitate any significant problems for the church in terms of membership loss or any other problems?
some problems. I may state that through the years, you've had maybe somewhat of a shift. Those who stayed in Kane Home, and it was kind of unique. The individuals who stayed in Kane Homes, which was a federal project, and joined Second Baptist, eventually left the project and bought a home. Whereas a number of the individuals who just remained there didn't join Second. I'm not making just a case out of Second Baptist, but there were others who joined who were members for one reason or another before even going there, but and could have done the same thing. But I made some little studies of this. Well, when they left South Waco and bought a home in East Waco, and a fewer number in North Waco, they still maintained their loyalty to the church. Since kind of in the process of '72, we bought a van because they had buses had been pulled off of the routes for Sunday. Maybe a number of years, several years before that time, but this was getting to be a noticeable thing that here people who would be here, but they have no transportation. The bus is not running on Sunday. So that helped too, because we wanted to get that to keep the aquarium and also reach out with evangelism to bring in others who would want to come. Another thing that has been unique, Second Baptist being almost at that time 100 years old, the roots were pretty deep. In fact, it's maybe the second. New Hope is 113 or 14 years old, and Second Baptist 100 last year. So your roots get to be pretty deep in the generations, and so you had this loyalty to Second Baptist. This is where grandmother and grandfather, where my dad and mother were members. I was born there, physically and spiritually. So you have this, so it's historical period gives it. So we've been able to maintain, by and large, you lose members every year by way. Some move out of town to other jobs. A few join maybe another church because of convenience of marriage to certainly by death. But we've been able to maintain a balance. We gained last several years more than we lost. So we're holding our own, more or less, which is pretty equal maybe to even our population. That's about all we're doing.
Yeah.
So compared with the Waco population, we're holding our own.
All right. We don't want to dwell on this because we want to move along in our story, but Baylor secured most all of this land. There are a few private homes about, I know in the Edgefield community still, there are maybe 3 or 4 still owned by the individuals there, but Baylor got the Kane Homes and just about everything. Has Baylor ever tried to secure the property of Second Baptist Church?
Indirectly, possibly.
I see. I didn't know whether they had ever.
No, they've never
Sought directly get it.
No.
Purchase it.
Letter came to me from one of the officials that they understood or heard that we wanted to sell. But that's...
You let him know that was a misunderstanding.
Bad,
Right.
Yeah, rumor.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's not the way to do it.
Right.
Do business.
All right. Well, let's talk about church life at Second Baptist during the late 50s and early 60s. Were there any issues other than the ones we have mentioned that were important, or any developments that were important in the life of the church or in your life, say in the last couple of years of the 50s, the first few years of the 60s?
I don't believe so, other than I would think more or less in general, in a general fashion, compared to other churches, I wouldn't say that there's been anything that stands out and above and beyond.
Right.
We've had the regular annual occasions. We have been on the radio now for what, about 30 years.
Mm.
KWTX 1030.
Mm-hmm.
It's have quite a listening audience, white and black. We get echoes from that from time to time.
What kind of echoes do you get? Do you get letters, or do people call you, or?
I guess I could get more letters if I asked for them.
Mhm.
Just my nature to, and I guess we could get more money. We get a few donations here and there, but I haven't asked for that.
Mm-hmm.
The church assumed it, and because each man has his own way of doing it, but I felt the church has underwritten the budget, and so I don't want to use up to 30 minutes, which is not too long, making appeals for dollars. But we get, by and large, it's been good response. We just tried to keep the gospel truths
Mm-hmm.
as a message. Haven't tried to use the radio channel or the pulpit as a stance for any haranguing
Mm-hmm.
one way or another. Just try to preach the gospel.
Well, there's one other thing I'd like to deal with. You've been very active in NAACP organization in Austin.
Mm-hmm.
You moved to Waco. What did you find in terms of NAACP activity, and what did you do
Mm-hmm.
in terms of that organization in Waco?
Mm-hmm. Okay, when I came in '58, Reverend Hegman was the president of the branch here. And of course, in about a year, about '59, he answered the call to go to Fort Worth. And of course, I came here as having a record of being the president of branch in Austin, and they reached to get me. I didn't want the presidency because I'd served 8 years in Austin. But being committed to it and no one else seemingly standing in line at the time, I accepted it. And I'm committed to the cause.
Mm-hmm.
And we, let me see, how soon was that? We discovered that the schools hadn't been integrated here. In fact, no appeal had been made to the school board as such. It appeared that they'd made some kind of move, which was not a positive move, but it had been a vote of some sort. I don't remember it now. That it sort of quieted things down in terms of, but be that as it may, we knew that we were going to have to make a stance, make this presentation to the school board to move forward with desegregation. In fact, Waco was trailing practically all the cities. Whatever, some cities were doing something. If they weren't doing too much, they were at least doing something. Waco hadn't made its move, so we went before the we met with the school board and talked with them. It was supposed to have been a secret meeting, but some kind of way the secret got out. It hit the Dallas paper and hit the news here then, and my wife was working on a master's at Prairie View College, and she heard it down there that NAACP and the school board had met. So the news did get out. And I remember the fellow, the editor from Dallas, that sort of wrote to Dallas. He was editor here. Well, we had a meeting together, and when it was all settled pretty well to get things in hock, we were going to have to make our move to set up our case. And we did set up a date where our kids went to numbers of the schools over town. And then when they were turned down, we filed suit. And George McGrew, you may know him. Anyhow, he's one of our deacons. His son was used as maybe the front runner client-wise in this lawsuit to desegregate the schools in Waco.
What year was that?
That was either 63 or 64.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. My wife was working on
You mentioned she was working on her graduate degree at Prairie View.
Mm-hmm.
Had she given any attention to, or did she? Well, Baylor was not integrated.
No.
Did she even raise that question in her own mind about going to Baylor, or maybe
yes.
raise it with the?
Oh, yes.
She did. What was she told?
Well, I think some efforts had been made somewhere along the line, but it was pretty well established by, papers with other schools integrating. You just pretty well knew where you could go and where you couldn't.
Yeah.
And many times, unless you wanted to make a case out of a thing, of course, we wouldn't maybe sought to make a case out of it. It's going to whole lots of expense and trouble. And we believe in cases,
Yeah.
NAACP. We had to file more during that period, but here again, a number of schools had opened, but Baylor was closed.
Mm.
So she had to drive down there. In the summer, she would, one summer, well, the final summer, getting a degree, she stayed. But during the school year, she would drive down on the weekend, Saturday. She'd carpool. Sometime I'd drive for the carpool for her. She'd work all the week teaching, and we'd leave here about 4 o'clock or 5 o'clock Saturday morning, going down. Take several courses on Saturday, come back in Saturday evening. But Baylor was not integrated at that time. So, yeah.
All right. I want us to discuss in some detail the court case and the process by which the Waco schools came to be integrated, and the role that you and the NAACP and others played in that. I don't think we have time today probably to pursue that. But there is one other question I have about your first coming to Waco. Was there any kind of contact between you as an incoming pastor of a significant Black Baptist church with any of the white churches in Waco? Did any white pastor, for example, greet you, or was there any kind of relationship with the Baptist Association or anything like that in your first years first few years here in Waco?
I don't remember whether it was the first year or not, but the Waco Ministerial Alliance was integrated during my early ministry here. And they were meeting up at the Methodist Church, the St. Mary's. I believe that's the church that's out near Cobb's Drive. Now, they were down on the track at that time, here on 4th or 5th in the track. And that's where we were meeting at that time. And I became a member of that. And there may have been even some little discussions as to where we could meet at that time as an integrated group. I don't know whether some other place was discussed, whether it was discussed that we stay there, but whatever, we went on up in that the question was being raised and maybe some debates on it. We went up to the Central YMCA. We stayed there for a number of years.
All right.
That was one. Then Second Baptist had a fellowship with Emmanuel Baptist Church. I can't call his name. I've talked with him a number of times. He was here at that time. His name right on the end of my tongue.
We can add that later.
Right, very friendly fellow. I don't know whether we had a chance to. We didn't have a fellowship church-wise, but I did get to meet him. And he was very cordial.
All right. Well, we will conclude our conversation today. Appreciate your taking the time out again from a very busy schedule, and we'll look forward to continuing our story at a later time.
Good. All right.